Welcome everyone to an evening with David Steele and friends. I am Joan Grosgenois-Thomas, CEO of JGT Public Relations, producers of this program, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. We have a great program lined up for you this evening. As we close Black History Month, we hope that you will come away from this event enlightened, informed, and entertained. David Steele has been a professional sports journalist for more than 35 years and currently writes for the legal news site Law 360. He has written for Sporting News, AOL, the Baltimore Sun, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Newsday. David has contributed to ESPN's The Undefeated, USA Today, and the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. He is the co-author of Silent Gesture, the autobiography of Toni Smith, and of 4 Generations of Color, the autobiography of pioneering baseball scout and sports agent Miles McAfee. He has won writing awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, the Association of Black Media Workers, the Associated Press Sports Editors, and the Society of Professional Journalists. His latest book, It Was Always a Choice, Picking Up the Baton of Athlete Activism, was published in the summer of 2022. It was named one of the best books in the arts and humanities of that year by the Library Journal. His book is available on Kindle Books, Barnes & Noble, Thrift Books, Book Depository, Indigo, Amazon, and Temple University Press. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Steele. Hey, David. I'm not hearing you. Are you muted?
I am not anymore. I hope you can hear me.
3 years in and we still can't figure it out.
Exactly.
How are you?
I am very good, and I heard all of that introduction, and I'm so flattered, and I'm so happy to be here to be able to talk to everybody here, talk to the panel, and talk about the topics of this book.
Yeah, and so just want to make sure that everybody who's listening and watching knows that we've got a relationship. We are related by marriage. I am married to your second cousin, right?
That's
second
right.
Cousin or first cousin?
Yeah,
His name is also David.
Yeah, it's all right. Believe it or not, he was big Dave when we were growing up, and I was little David. And
yeah, I think you're all square now. Yeah. Anyway, so we're so glad that you could be with us and do this event this evening. We were so happy to pull this together. And we have a great lineup. It's going to be a great program. So let's start off actually, because you're going to read an excerpt that you selected from your book. And why don't we just get to it, right? Let's just jump in.
I'd absolutely love to, yes. And this is from It Was Always a Choice, Picking Up the Baton of Athlete Activism. This is chapter 2 of the book. The the chapter of the title was Colin Kaepernick and His Spiritual Predecessors. As he said to the NFL Network's Steve Wyche at the beginning, Colin Kaepernick knew that the consequences of his decision to protest could be severe. Athletes, celebrities, and everyone with something tangible to lose understand that. It's the reason that they regularly give for staying away from challenging statements or actions, if they give one at all. Kaepernick, though, also understood this from the education that he had undertaken to reach his decision. Cultural footprints left by Tommie Smith and John Carlos are easy to see, even for somebody who isn't a student of the history of activism. They, in turn, followed the footprints left by others, and their own footprints had been followed by others before Kaepernick, who had learned firsthand about the toll that it would take. Smith and Carlos willingly became brothers in the fight for racial justice and equality and the elevation of human rights worldwide, even though they were not particularly close otherwise. The most contentious moments of their relationship have made their differences seem more severe than they really are. What those differences illustrate more than anything, though, is that two men from differing backgrounds, traveling separate paths to a shared destination while experiencing similar events and influences, can produce a result that will stand for eternity. They arrived at the fight from opposite directions, but they went through the same travails to get there and cared about reaching their goal above everything else. As much as their arrival on the medal stand in the infield of Mexico City's Estadio Olímpico Universitario on October 16, 1968, is occasionally portrayed as a quirky coincidence. One of the things that Smith and Carlos differ on is how they ended up sharing one pair of black gloves, for instance. There was never any doubt about why they were there and whether they would have still chosen to be there if given a chance. Both men have never wavered in saying that they would do it all over again.
Wow, thank you for that, David. You know, it's remarkable when you think about it from that perspective that, you know, John and Tommy came from, you know, two different places. They didn't expect to be brought together in that way at that time, right? They just came to compete, and yet they found themselves in that circumstance.
They did, and it's sort of fills in some of the gaps of how I got to this book in particular. As you had mentioned, and I very much appreciate you doing that. I was Tommy Smith co-author for his autobiography in 2007, Silent Gesture, and that sort of put me on a path toward continuing to follow what athletes did in order to use their platform to enlighten the world, to take advantage of their visibility, to make the kind of change that others who don't have that same kind of visibility wouldn't necessarily have. But in the, it's amazing, you think that 16 years since then, so much has happened. That's why Colin Kaepernick is obviously a very prominent voice in this book and in the movement that we spoke about. You know, the book really kind of ties their history together, goes back to the history that led up to what Tommy Smith and John Carlos did in 1968, and then goes beyond what Colin Kaepernick did starting in 2016, up to what's been going on right now, including the summer of 2020, when the uprisings around George Floyd's murder by the police reignited the entire movement of athletes stepping to the forefront to make a social impact and a social change.
Yeah, that's, and there's so much to talk about. Why don't we get to it? Because you've got a couple of guests who are going to be joining you now. One of whom you wrote about in your book. Toni Smith-Thompson was a student at Manhattanville College in Westchester when she engaged in her activism. After college, Toni worked with the field department of the New York Civil Liberties Union, where she worked on a number of campaigns, including efforts to move away from punitive and carceral responses to youth behavior and to protect students' First Amendment rights to engage in protest. She is currently the New York State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, the leading organization in the United States promoting alternatives to the war on drugs. Please welcome Toni Smith-Thompson. Hi, Toni.
Hi, good evening. Hi.
Good evening. So glad you can join us.
I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Our next guest is Kevin Blackistone. You probably recognize Kevin from his contributions to as a panelist on ESPN's Around the Horn. He is a national sports columnist at the Washington Post, a professor at the University of Maryland. He's co-producer and co-writer of an award-winning 2022 documentary on the history of the fight against mascoting Native Americans. He is an author in his own right, having co-authored a memoir of former NFL starter Everson Walls, as well as authoring several academic journal articles on sports media. Kevin was a sports columnist for AOL's Fan House, and the Dallas Morning News. He started his career at the Boston Globe before moving to the Chicago Reporter, a monthly investigative magazine on Chicago's racial and social issues. He also wrote the sports column at Emerge, a monthly review of politics and culture that Time magazine hailed as an uncompromising voice that made it the nation's best Black news magazine. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good friends with David Steele, my man. We used to work together at AOL, and Toni Smith, a frequent visitor to my class to talk about this very topic, protest in sports. Thank you.
That's terrific. So before I leave you to your discussion, I want our audience to know, whoever is here, that there will be a Q&A after this particular segment. And if anyone wants to ask a question, by all means, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. We will vet the questions and we'll hopefully get to as many questions as time will allow. But for now, I'm going to turn this back over to David and take it away. I'll see you soon.
Joan, thank you so much for all of that. And absolutely thank you to Kevin and to Toni, because you guys have been obviously such great influences on all the work I've done, both as a journalist and as somebody who's has now had an opportunity to write about these topics as often as I have, especially, including in this book. And you'll both be looking at this from, interesting perspectives. Kevin, like you said, you had such a long career as a journalist, and Toni, you have a very significant role in a lot of what we speak about and what I've written about in the book with what you did at Manhattanville College 20 years ago. So from your perspectives, and I'll start with Kevin. From what you've learned, why are sports such an effective backdrop for societal protest and activism as opposed to other forms that have been used by activists and what has been done by other people in other forms of entertainment who also have tremendous visibility?
Sure. Well, a number of years ago, after Colin Kaepernick knelt with the national anthem as his mixtape to make a point, I redesigned one of the courses I teach at the University of Maryland into something I call sports protest and media, to examine the question that you just asked. And one of the things that I've learned, or two things I've learned along the way in this course, that number one, if you think about maybe the most iconic sports event in the Olympics, it would be the marathon. And the marathon was born out of nationalism. It was born out of militarism. It was born out of politics at the time in 490 BC, when a messenger, Phidippides, was sent by the Athenians to deliver the message of a war, of an invasion that the Athenians had pulled off and had conquered. So sports is rooted not just in competition, but also in very serious issues of the day. And the other thing I came to realize is that, and we all know this, sports is difficult to not to pay attention to. Not only today when we're just saturated with sports, that's part of it, but just through history. Sports has always dominated our attention. And one of the interesting things, or two of the interesting things that have come out of that domination of our attention is that one, sports is unable really to squelch someone's voice or someone's activism because it's on such a giant stage. And number two, those who engage in it often surprise themselves and the rest of us in their ability to garner support for whatever their protest is. So just to use Colin Kaepernick as an example, who would have thought that when he dropped to a knee to do what he did in the most militaristic, patriotic sport or maybe event that this country has, the National Football League, that he would have garnered the support of people in the military, because the hashtag Veterans for Colin Kaepernick developed in the immediate wake of his protest. So those are the things that I would just point out. One, there's been a historical connection. Two, people who involve themselves in it, even Colin Kaepernick, despite the fact that he's been drummed out of the league, really his voice has not been muzzled. And three, you're able to garner support for whatever it is your stance might be.
Very fascinating. Toni, if you could, from where you were as an athlete in college, and certainly as you've had a chance to look at it as you've moved on through all the things you've done in your career, why was sports something special? Why was that something you were able to take advantage of the way you were?
I think Sports is, I mean, at its core in this country, sports are one of our biggest public squares and one of the remaining public squares as our public spaces are eroded, as public education is dismantled, as universal healthcare is shunned. Like, think about the places where multiple types of people, large swaths of people come together. Sports really is the biggest space for that. And because sports is so deeply held in our culture, like, people really have a sense of ownership and belonging, almost to a fault sometimes, right? And so people feel very passionate and personal about what happened in their sports space, in their arena, with their team and their players. You know, people really think of sports as like, this is mine. And so even thinking about my own sports experience, I was a D3 athlete, right? Like, by no means the largest audience, but I think that level of ownership that people have over not just the sports and their team, but the culture of sport. People care about what sport is looking like across the country or in a different school, because it might impact and how they view sports. And when you think about sports, it really embodies so much of the best and the worst of American culture, right? Like the violence, the war, the dominance, the branding, the consumerism, the masculinity, all of that comes to a head in the sports arena. And people hold on to that. They don't necessarily want that to change. And so when you use that space to challenge a core piece of how our country operates, people are gonna have a problem with it.
Yeah, when that seems to be the entire history of of protests when it comes to athletes. You know, there's such an incredible backlash to it. So I kind of like to get it from you, Toni. You went through all of this during the time that you did, and you've also had a chance to watch what others have done in the years since. Would you see athletes that take the step that you did, and Tommie Smith did, and John Carlos, and all the others throughout history, and you see the ones that made a very conscious choice not to, when they had an equal amount of visibility and sometimes more? And I think we know a lot of the athletes that we always mention in that context. What do you think of the decisions that they make, of the choices that they make to either step up the way that they do and for the reasons that they do, and the decision to not do it, and to very publicly say, that is not why I'm here, whereas that is not what I do?
My opinion on this has changed a lot over the years. I mean, it really has been a roller coaster. I think when I was protesting, I'd never even asked a teammate to join me. I may have wished that they would. I may have wanted there to be more protest happening, but I didn't actually ask or expect anyone to join me. And then over the years, there are moments where you're like, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you standing up? You're looking in on other athletes. But ultimately, I feel the same way I feel about everyone else in society. People take action when they're moved to. And when you think about these different moments of athlete and periods of activism, you have moments where, like with John Carlos and Tommie Smith, they too were alone on the podium, but there was this enormous movement underneath them, behind them, and in front of them, right? Kind of like undergirding their protest. With Colin Kaepernick, you had a huge movement that had already grown and was kind of around him to sort of leverage him and harness him up. So I think that kind of understanding to protest is to assume risk. And we need that, right? Like, for anything to change, you need people to assume risk in order to push those boundaries. And at the same time, I have a lot more grace in thinking about what those risks actually mean to people and whether they're going to be able to bounce back from those consequences. And as we've seen, many people have not been able to bounce back, and our society is not forgiving, especially of Black folks. Right. And so there is a real grace also in what people are considering when they're thinking about taking those risks. But we want to push people to be moved, to be part of a movement, and to take a risk. So that's sort of how I see it today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Toni, my thinking on this has evolved over the years as well. And, you know, one of the first things I always tell people is that in a democracy, I want everyone to be involved. Whether you're a football player, whether you're a plumber, whether you're a teacher, a lawyer, a CEO, you clean our streets. No matter whether you're unemployed, whether you're part of the lumpen proletariat, it takes the involvement of everyone to be to make a democracy. So there was a time when I thought differently of the attention paid to athletes, the attention that they can garner on their platform when it comes to expressing progressive politics, because that's what I stand for. That's where my politics are. And now I don't necessarily feel that way, because in some ways I feel as if all the attention that we in the media have paid to athletes because of their platform, and when they speak out, I sometimes think it's an insult to all of those who have been doing this forever, right? The choir that they have actually joined. And sometimes I think, despite of what I said in the answer to the first question you posed, sometimes I think we pay too much attention to sports as an arena where these ideas can be pushed. And I'd rather hear from people who really put in the time and the study into these particular issues. I'd rather hear their voice. I'd rather hear them, see them at the vanguard of these movements. So I think some of the attention we've paid to sports over the years has become somewhat of a conundrum. One of the things I'll just say this briefly. When you look back at the history of Black folk in this country, and all the things that they've done and all the struggle that they put in, I'm thinking about, W.D. Du Bois' birthday is upon us right now, and all the work that he put in on a variety of issues. And you quote him in your book, his thoughts about sport. And I dare say that what he did and what he thought and what he wrote about and what he studied and what he advocated and how he went about it has been far more important than a lot of the athletes who right now we elevate as spokespeople for this movement. And I also think we've gotten to a point where we've confused activism with performance. And I don't think that the two are necessarily the same. Just because you wear a T-shirt with a slogan on it doesn't necessarily mean you're an activist. So I think I think there's been some muddling of these two terms.
Can I say something? Oh, I'm so glad you just went there, Professor, because we've also conflated activism with progressive activism. And, when we talk about whether athletes choose or don't choose to use their platform, coming out of the last 3 years, I'm sort of in a place of like, I care less about whether you choose or don't choose and what you're actually doing, yep. Right? Like some of what has been called protest over the last 3 years has made me cringe. Did not love, for example, NFL teams linking arms with the owners and that being branded as activism, right? Like really, there's a lot of
co-optation. That's co-optation,
right? Exactly. And we knew that was going to happen. We saw it happening. And we tend to, because athletes are so visible, we also tend to give them a lot of dispensation, a lot of attention for doing very little sometimes. And so being really clear about what we kind of holding the bar someplace for activism, like you said, Professor, right? Like sometimes it's performance, sometimes it's branding, sometimes it's just saying a thing. So being clear about that.
And if I could jump in real quick, and I know, Joan, we're going to be on real quick. We saw so much of this. We saw it almost multiply in 2020, not only after George Floyd protests, but after Jacob Blake was killed by the police in Kenosha. The things that first athletes did to generate something, but then the leagues, there's such a great word, co-opting. They just came in and almost swallowed that entire original movement up and did things that were just like, performative, is probably the best word I can think of. It's the kindest word I could say in public on this platform. So I think that's where we are now. So I'm sorry, Joan, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was a great discussion, and I just want to remind our audience that they can drop their questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and so we would be happy to try to answer, as many questions as we can. But we do have one question that's come in, and that is actually directed to Toni, specifically about what was it that spurred your activism while you were at Manhattanville? Can you, help us understand and guide us what brought that on?
It was very similar to what Colin Kaepernick has said, very similar to what Mahmoud Abdul Rauf has said. If you haven't seen his documentary, Stand, it's very good. It was a process of learning, right? It's where I would happen to be in school. Colin Kaepernick was not in school, right? Like wherever you're doing that learning, it was a process of understanding, situating my own experience in this country with systems and structures and how it all fits together. You start making connections between economic inequality, why basketball courts in one neighborhood have nets and plexiglass and others barely have a floor that is workable, right? Why there's such disparate resources, why education looks so different across neighborhoods, right? Like why some neighborhoods are so heavily incarcerated and some aren't. And when I was in educational settings in sociology courses, beginning to put all that together and then couple that with the impending invasion in 2002, post 9/11, when you begin to look at how all of this is being used together, and you see that all of these issues that kind of like are what is called patriotism here, which is more like nationalism, is being used to advance domestic and international policy and how that impacts Black and Brown people across the globe. It's the same connections that Tommy and John were making. And then you get to a place where you're like, I'm standing for this, and you're going to use my stance as a way to further this policy, these platforms. No, not in my name.
David, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I remember
we only have a few minutes. I just want
when Toni and I first spoke, and this was for an article on very much these same topics for the Sporting News back in 2018. You taught me so much about exactly what it was, because I think that I was sort of held captive by the framing that was done by like the networks, the ESPN, CNN, the New York Times, and all the people who were saying, and they were, sort of framing it not only around, sort of what their sort of surface reaction to it was, but also the reaction by everybody else. And in a lot of ways, and this is sort of a commentary more on, how it was covered, how the public sort of perceived it, more so on what you actually did. The message got muddled a lot. And I think we saw a lot of that with Colin Kaepernick when he first started speaking, when, that everyone started talking about, oh, he's disrespecting the troops, he's disrespecting the military, he's disrespecting the police. And they dragged the message far, far, far from its origins. And I felt in a lot of ways, before we spoke, that it happened with me, because I was hearing so much about your motivations about them from you that I had never heard before.
Kevin, certainly want to give you an opportunity to chime in if there's anything you want to contribute to that.
No, I mean, that's why I have Toni in my class. I mean, she summed it up, brilliantly. And I've had her speak to my class before about the origins of her protests. And it's interesting that she pointed out that she was in school then and that Kaepernick was not. But the through thread there is that both educated themselves on their issue, on their topic. And in Kaepernick's case, he was actually auditing a class that was taught by a friend of his girlfriend. And one of the books that he read was on critical race theory. I believe it was Patricia Hill Collins, who at the time had written the book Black Feminist Thought when she was at the University of Maryland. And that was a critical piece of education for him to understand the situation that we as people of color are in.
Thank you so much. Again, just a reminder to our audience, please drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A feature below. We have one other question that's come in, and that's for David, asking what has been the reaction you've received having written this book? We know you've gotten some great reviews, but what are people saying to you when they see you?
I think what the reaction I've gotten the most is that they're glad to see another discussion of this, because I you sort of get to see where everybody is in their thought process about this entire topic. Whether they sort of go back a few years and remember the 60s and 70s with Tommie Smith and John Carlos and the luminaries like the Bill Russells and people like that. Whether they sort of came to a little more consciousness, sometimes through what Toni did back in the early 2000s. They began to recognize it, or they recognized the things with Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf or Craig Hodges in the NBA when they made their statements and sort of suffered the consequences. Others became more aware, obviously, with Colin Kaepernick and the way that spread through so many other sports. And maybe they caught on a little more as they saw it reach into other sports and see other prominent athletes do it. And others, again, from a couple of years ago, when they saw what individual athletes and teams, like the way the Milwaukee Bucks players, the WNBA players, players, athletes, Naomi Osaka, different players reacting to George Floyd and Jacob Blake, and seeing more visibly the people like LeBron James and I Can't Breathe shirts and things like that, which of course you talked about that a little bit yourself, Kevin, about how what that really means. But they all sort of reacted to it and said, I'm glad to sort of see that this is being recognized and that this is a broad thing. I'm glad to see more of a understanding of the history of it, what led to it, what some of the predecessors to these sort of movements were, and sort of gaining a broader understanding. And they're happy to have more of a background on what's happened, and they can see a lot more clearly what's going on now and what might happen going forward.
Thank you so much for that. And so I don't think we have any other questions. We're actually ready to move on to our next segment. And just wanted to make sure that our audience also knows, when you received your confirmation email for this event, there was a link in which you could go to purchase the book. Again, it was always a choice, picking up the baton of athlete activism. And you're here with an evening with David Steele and friends. And so now we're ready to move on to our next segment. And for those of you who are more sports oriented fans, I think you're going to enjoy this. And Kevin and Toni will be back with you after the intro, and you're going to be joined by two other guests, David Alldridge and Shalise Manza Young. So David, are you ready to premiere your new show?
About as ready as I'll ever be. So let's get started.
All right, folks, I'm going to jump off here. We are going to have another Q&A after this segment. And so enjoy this, and I'll see you all on the other side.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for staying with us tonight. Yes, this is our segment where we talk more of in a roundtable form about the events that are happening in sports right now. And again, yes, it's titled Steele on the Field. And we're welcoming back Kevin Blackistone and Toni Smith-Thompson from the first part of our show. We're really grateful that you all both had an opportunity to talk about the broader issues about this, about that were addressed in this book and that you guys have addressed so many times before. And I'd like to introduce two more additions to our panel this evening. And I'm extremely glad I've had the great pleasure to have known both of us for a very long time and have really cherished their friendship and the fact that they've been colleagues of mine for such a long time. Shalise Manza Young is a national columnist for Yahoo Sports, a role she began in 2020. A working sports journalist since she was 17, Shalise wrote for the Providence Journal and the Boston Globe, covering numerous sports before becoming the New England Patriots beat writer. Her work has been awarded by the Associated Press sports editors and the Professional Football Writers of America. Shalise, welcome.
Hey, David, thank you for having me.
Very glad to have you. We're also joined by David Alldridge, who's a senior columnist for The Athletic. He's worked for nearly 30 years covering the NBA and other sports for Turner, ESPN, and the Washington Post. In 2016, he received the Kurt Gowdy Media Award from the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame and the Legacy Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. He also covered the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona. He's covered the NBA and the NFL, the Stanley Cup playoffs, the World Series, the Indianapolis 500, and the US Open Tennis Championships. David, welcome.
Oh, David, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad we have this. This is an outstanding panel we have here to talk about a lot of different topics. What I want to do before we move on to sort of the current events, things that are happening right now, I'd like to sort of ask our two newcomers a little bit about what we talked about in the first half of the show. And of course, Kevin and Toni, you can weigh in as well after we hear from Shalise and David. But, you know, you all have been around for a long time, and you all have like literally, you know, within the last couple of days been, you know, involved and engaged very actively in some events that are going on. I've seen some of these things close up. Where do you see the state of athlete activism right now, where we are currently in sports? And we'll start with you, Shalise.
You know, I think one of the things that Kevin and Toni mentioned is really what rings the most to me, is that I think, unfortunately, we're seeing too much performative type of things and not enough actual action. You know, the NFL players, I've written about the NFL for years, but the players kind of fold like a house of cards when it comes to certain things. Even in the NBA, you know, I just think a lot of it, the WNBA is always going to be the WNBA. They're their standard bearers. But even, you know, I was in Tokyo for the last Summer Games, and there were threats of what if you protest and what happens. And the IOC, one of the most corrupt sports institutions on the planet, you know, sort of threatened players. And the only American player, because again, the United States, especially if you take away the Black athletes from the United States in the Olympics, they're just another country, right? But the Black athletes go to the Olympics, and it was obviously about a year after George Floyd. And the only one who did anything was Raven Saunders, a shot putter. And she raised her hands in the X above her head on the medal stand. She was a silver medalist in the women's shot put. And nobody else really did anything of substance, you know, and they're the ones who have track and field athletes don't make nearly the money that like NBA players and WNBA players don't make that much. But, you know, it just seems like we're at a point where there's a lot of hashtags and wearing of t-shirts, but how much action is really being put forth?
David, your thoughts?
You know, I would say a few things. I think to Kevin and Toni's point earlier, I've also, my position on this has evolved over the years. You know, when I was young once, believe it or not, and when I was younger, you know, like a lot of people, I thought, God, why isn't Michael Jordan doing more? Why isn't he saying more? Why isn't he doing this, that, and the third? And you come to realize, I think, over time that the reason why Tommy Smith and John Carlos are so celebrated is because what they did is really hard to do. What they sacrificed is a lot to ask out of most people. Most people just can't do it. They can't, for whatever reason. It's not how they're wired. It's not where their values are. Some people like to do stuff quietly. I know that's it's an insane thought in our society today, but there are people that like to do things quietly and not draw attention to themselves. So I think that it's evolved. My position on that is evolved. And as you also mentioned, like, just because someone's a great athlete doesn't mean that they're a great activist. You know what I mean? It's a different skill set. It really is. It's a totally different skill set. The one thing that encourages me has nothing to do really with the athletes. It has to do with social media. And we can see the power of social media. You can see why Elon Musk is attacking Twitter, the very company that he bought, the way he's attacking it, because it's a very effective way to get news out. It's a very effective way to coalesce public opinion. It's a very effective way for young people to talk to one another. And social media, whether it's Twitter or your phone or whatever, we don't find out about George Floyd unless those people film it. We don't find out. We get the police version like we get every time that he was resisting arrest. We had no choice. We were in fear for our lives, which is what they always say. And it didn't work this time because we had the tape. And that is what encourages me about whether it's athlete activism or activism in general, is that I think we have more people with more tools to document these things and to call attention to them and to bring public attention to them very quickly, much more so than we did even 10 years ago, much less 20 years ago, much less, in 1968.
If I can jump in just really quickly, because I agree 100%. I think it is very hard to expect some athletes to be as on top of things. And I think it was Kevin who mentioned, you almost want to make sure that the people who have been doing the work are getting the recognition. And I remember a few years ago, there was an event through Instagram, and I can't remember if it was George Floyd or maybe a little before that, but there were some white women, famous white women with really large Instagram followings who gave over their Instagram accounts for a day to Black women in academia and who have been doing the activism work for a very long time. And I think even something like that, think about if LeBron James handed over his Instagram account for a day to a leading abolitionist, activist, or to somebody, in that space, and to highlight the discrepancies in, court decisions and sentencing, to highlight the discrepancies, have Dwayne Wade or somebody else give their Instagram account over to a woman who is an expert in maternal mortality statistics and highlight why it is the discrepancies, that it doesn't matter if a Black woman is rich or poor, her risk of dying because of childbirth is the same. And that's not the same, not that any woman should die in childbirth, but you see a discrepancy with poor women versus wealthy white women, but there is no such difference. It's just Black women die at such alarming rates. And that is a way that they might learn something too, because we don't want them to be, we can't expect them to be experts in everything, but this is a way that a small thing that they can do. And they have millions of people who follow them on Instagram. And that is something that I think could potentially make a real difference in educating people.
Can I build on that? I love that so much, Shalise. And I think another thing, it's true, we can't expect athletes to be the most kind of read up on every issue, and the experts, they're not the experts often. There are people who do this every day. But I think when you talk about the state of athlete activism right now, as a country, we're in a state of retrenchment. We have the 2020 upheaval. We had swift, violent backlash. We now have multiple years of regression. We have policies attacking teaching and books and trans students and kids and people. So I think in moments like this, it would be really powerful for athletes not to position themselves as the experts, but to say, wait. We remember, we were talking about police violence. We were talking about unjustified murder. We were talking about police impunity. Like, we're talking about all of these issues. Let's not move away from that, right? Because I think the country largely would like to move on. White allies have moved on, and people are still on the ground being brutalized, being incarcerated. And so for athletes to say, wait, there's still people in the street, we need to draw attention back there. And I haven't seen really any athlete movement at all on the issue that started Cap's kneeling in the first place.
Kevin, I didn't know if you had any continued thoughts about that. Actually, before I ask you that, I think it's really fascinating that, we've now started talking about what's happening now and what athletes are capable of doing, and what any activist, anybody who wants to make change and use whatever platform they have, how different that all is now compared to, as you said, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even between when Colin Kaepernick started in 2016 and 2020, so much of the toolbox that all the activists have available to them, whether they're athletes or anybody else, has really changed. I don't know if everybody takes advantage of it the way they do, but they certainly do things differently than they did, like I said, like in the 60s, the 80s, and in the early 2000s. But before I just bounce back over to Kevin, Shalise, you made a great point about the WNBA, and we really could spend an entire hour talking about that, because they may be the best example of what athletes what athletes are capable of doing if they do make that decision to do it, and how you could use everything you have available to you in this environment today to draw attention to yourself. And at the time I wrote the book, obviously it was about all the police shootings and things like that. And then it was on to the general election later on in 2020. But we just saw what happened with Brittany Griner. They were the WNBA athletes, along with the people throughout women's basketball at every level. They're the one, maybe were the biggest motivating force to keep Brittany Griner in front of everybody's eyes and on everybody's mind until she got released. How much of that momentum would have even happened if it was not for them?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I'll just underscore something you said. It was the WNBA players. I'm not going to give any credit to the WNBA as a corporate body, because if you'll recall, when the Minnesota Lynx first protested against Philando Castile's murder, the WNBA fined the women who stood up for Philando Castile and his survivors. So it's the women who the individuals, and not the WNBA, the corporate body, who really made a difference. And I also like to point out that they came before Kaepernick. And I also like to point out before Kaepernick, there was LeBron James and Dwayne Wade and their visual performance to protest Trayvon Martin's murder. So, where are we today? I mean, there are a lot more tools at everyone's disposal. Some people use them. There are some people who are doing things quietly. Demario Davis, I've been really impressed with the work that he's been doing in terms of penal reform in Mississippi, and I think also in Louisiana, quietly behind the scenes. So there are people who are doing things, but there has been this retrenchment, and as Toni mentioned, and so you wonder, what are people going to do? What are all of us going to do, right? not just athletes, but all of us as a body. What are we going to do watching what's happening in the state of Florida right now? I would like to think that, if you're a Black parent of a potential college athlete or a guardian of a potential college athlete, that you would scratch Florida from your list of possibilities, with the exception maybe of the HBCUs that are there, to really to show that you can't stand for the what the DeSantis administration and the legislators are doing down there. So there are a lot more tools at people's disposal, but I think we all have to use them, and I'm not just going to put the onus on athletes.
Really, I really like that point. I was fortunate to do a radio show appearance last week up in Westchester County, New York, and I was asked that. It's like, well, what might be the next thing that athletes could do if we're no longer kneeling or raising a fist or anything like that. And my thought was, it is going to have to be some sort of collective action in terms of a boycott by athletes of either some sort of major event, or, as you mentioned, prospective student athletes. And I regret using that term right off the bat, but prospective, say, football, basketball players, things like that, saying, no, we're not going to go to any Florida institutions. So goodbye, University of Florida, goodbye, Florida State, Florida International, Florida Atlantic. We're not going to play football. We're not going to play basketball for you as long as these conditions exist. And we've seen that sort of thing where people try to generate boycotts of athletes performing in certain states where really reprehensible political and governmental acts have taken place. The All-Star game, NBA All-Star game several years ago in Charlotte was moved out of there for largely those same reasons. And obviously the biggest example is the Super Bowl. But again, that took a lot of outside pressure. It wasn't the athletes that actually did that. I know we're getting close to the Q&A portion of this. Hopefully there'll be a Q&A portion at the end of this, and there's time just flying so fast. I want to go ahead to what we're calling the lightning round. And really all I would love to hear from everybody on the panel is just, as you look at everything that's going on right now in sports, not necessarily athletics, but across the board in sports, is there a big story that jumps out at you that is going to be on your mind, that's going to get the most attention from you, that you're going to keep an eye on the most as we go forward, from the end of February, from the end of like the Super Bowl, All-Star Game, all these other things, as we go forward in 2023, what are some of the big stories that you're going to be and plot lines that you're going to be looking at? And we'll start with Shalise.
Sorry about that. It was just sort of mentioned, as I thought about it, one of the things that I will be looking for is, as we see, we all know what happened with the Dobbs decision last summer in terms of a woman's right to choose. But we have seen more and more states codify, and some of the brutal, cruel things that they want to do to women who decide to determine what happens to them. Will we see female athletes, and will we see queer athletes? Because we're also seeing a rise in anti-queer legislation. Will we see athletes come out and say, I am not playing? And this could directly affect South Carolina, right? The women's basketball team at South Carolina, there's laws in place going down in South Carolina. Could we see a 5-star women's basketball player who says, I would love to play for Dawn Staley, but I will not play in a state where I am not valued as a woman? And so I think that is something I will be really interested to see if we start seeing, we keep hearing about this generation of young people and how brave they are, and that they've lived their entire lives with, school shooter drills and all that kind of things. Will they be brave enough to say, I will not take my talents to X state because they do not value me as a human being?
David, your thoughts?
Well, I in this space, I primarily cover the NBA. I also cover the local teams here in Washington, and the Commanders changed their name a few years ago, finally. And it was always instructive to me that the only thing that got Dan Snyder to change the name was when FedEx said, we're out. That's it. There's nothing else. All the protests that Susan Harjo and the Native American community had done for 40 years, it didn't move the needle at all. But when Fred Smith said, I'm pulling out, I'm taking my name off of your stadium, the name changed in 72 hours. I mean, so to me, I wish I could say I am optimistic, but I can't say that strongly. The NBA is trying to do some things. They have a social justice coalition that has been working with people on Capitol Hill. They tried to lend their names, and people like Karl Anthony Towns and other star players did advertisements for the George Floyd Policing Act. Didn't go anywhere, right? And so I'm concerned about, how much we really can expect from people in the NBA, and LeBron James has done a ton. I mean, more than a vote, put poll workers on the ground in battleground states in 2020, in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and in Georgia. I mean, he did a lot. He has a school in Akron, Ohio that's putting kids through college. Like, he's really talking the talk and walking the walk. But even he can't, do it by himself. So I'm a little, to Tony's point, the retrenchment that we've seen is very powerful. And I'm a little concerned that we may be going back to an era, as you wrote about in the book, David, where there's just the period of time where the progress stops in terms of athlete activism, and it just kind of stands in place for a few years. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Shalise is right, that there will be athletes in every sport, whether it's basketball players or recruits in going to Florida. I think it's going to have to be a ground up, a bottom up thing, though. I don't think it's going to be a top down thing. I think it's going to be people, to your point, Shalise, that say, I'm not going to play in the tournament. I'm not going to do it, and that will be, I think, where you'll see real change. Nothing changed till Ed O'Bannon said, well, this is stupid. What do you, you know what I mean? It didn't, nothing changed. Ed O'Bannon said, no, wait, I should get paid for my name, image, and likeness. And that's what started it. But Ed O'Bannon wasn't a superstar basketball player. He was just a guy that got fed up, and that's what Toni said. It's just going to take somebody to get educated enough to be fed up, to become fed up with this, with the current status quo.
Absolutely. Kevin, I'd like to hear from you next. And when we do, since David was talking about the football team down here and the name change, please plug your the film that you produced that's making the festival rounds right now.
Sure. Well, I've been obsessed with this issue for I don't know, 30 years, and got around to making this film about it heavily because I was so enthralled by Suzanne Joan Harjo's activism over the years, her stick-to-itiveness to this issue, the fact that it is a seed to understanding racism in this country. There's a seed to racism in this country if you understand what happened to indigenous people in this land when Europeans first touched this soil. And I would also say that, it is true that Dan Snyder and every owner that has had a piece of this team was not going to change the name until economic pressure was brought to bear and in this case, with FedEx and Mr. Smith. But the pressure on FedEx and Mr. Smith was from the streets because people were burning shit down and everybody was in trouble. And so we went through this rapid recognition of the racism in this country. And that's what eventually knocked that down. So we did this film, Imagining the Indian, the fight against Native American mascoting, and we're very pleased to see it get some accolades, and it's going to be released to theaters for a theatrical run starting at the end of next month. But I want to also go back to something else that David mentioned, and that was Ed O'Bannon. And so one of the things I've been very interested to watch over the last year or so is a case called Johnson versus the NCAA. Trey Johnson was a football player at Villanova, and basically he is suing the NCAA, saying that he, as a college athlete, has performed a function no different than an employee, and that college athletes should in fact be considered employees. And so if we paid attention to the Supreme Court, the thoughts of the Supreme Court justices over the past year on these sorts of cases, they seem to be leaning in his favor. And so I think that one of the most interesting things to me will be when college athletes, those particularly in revenue generating sports, which are football and men's basketball primarily, dominated by Black male athletes, which is why this is a Black male issue, and it shouldn't be confused as anything other than that, get their fair share of the riches that they are producing for everyone else involved in college athletics. That's why that's why I don't get nervous about using the phrase plantation economy when you talk about college sports, because these guys are the ones who are generating the revenues, and they deserve a much bigger slice of the pie, an equitable slice of the pie. They need to be taken care of years down the road, because you can get CTE when you're in college, not just when you're in the NFL. You can have debilitating injuries, and they need to be taken care of. And so that's one of the things that I'm really looking at in this year.
So fascinating. And real quick, Toni, before I go to you, I just want to point out that it's really amazing that the three of you all talked about issues that sort of run through college sports. And we talk about sort of the power the college athletes can wield if they do wield them. And yet at the same time, simultaneously, we're talking about how powerless and how exploited they have been in so many areas we've talked about with Black athletes, Black male athletes, female athletes across the board, just gay athletes. It's really kind of fascinating how this system right now, so much of it runs through what is done, how they are used, how college athletes is going to play such a big role in all of this. It's really, really fascinating. I'm sorry,
If I can, I'll just add just one thing because it's been brought up. This is the educational system, right? And so if you are inculcated from a young kid through our educational system about your role as an athlete, then why would you necessarily change when you become a college athlete or a professional athlete, right? You've already been, this has already been drummed into your mind in terms of your place. And so it's not just on them as kids and as college students and as professional athletes, it's also on their parents and their guardians to pay attention to the situation, to the system that they are in, and not to continue to allow themselves to be exploited. So I always tell parents and guardians of prospective college students, and I tell college students this too, who happen to be athletes, read Das Kapital and read Walter Byers' memoir on exploiting the college athlete. I mean, he lays it out right there. He is the architect of the modern day NCAA. The book is called Unsportsmanlike Conduct, Exploiting the College Athlete. It's unbelievable.
Absolutely. That's such a great addition to that. Thanks so much. So we will finish up with the college athlete on our panel. Toni, if you have thoughts about that.
Listen, I mean, we could end with a professor over here talking about Das Kapital and exploitation, but that's exactly where I was going to go. I think what I'm looking at, not just this year, but kind of now going forward, is the degree of economic inequality in this country is untenable. And as opportunities grow for athletes to gain prominence, branding opportunities, endorsements, salaries, they're becoming further and further away from the people on the ground, and more entrenched in the ownership class, right? In the celebrity class. And it's really hard to maintain yourself as an activism when you are so squarely on the other side of this. And so as movements, I mean, listen, 2012, we had Occupy Wall Street, right? So as we come back to economic inequality, that implicates the athletes, right? At some point, they're going to have to reckon with the fact that the opportunities for them to, the opportunities for LeBron to endorse a new Hummer is directly opposed to people on the ground talking about the way that they're exploited, the way that they're incarcerated, working for pennies a day, the way that they are kind of like saddled with fines and fees by police to pay for public facilities that include stadiums. Like, all of this implicates athletes who are going to be increasingly part of this capital class. And the people may come for them too, and should.
Yep.
So, David, I think we need a part 2 to this.
I think so too.
It seems cruel to end it here.
Yeah, and how to contain all of this.
Yeah, but it is a little after 8, and we unfortunately need to wrap this up. We won't have time, unfortunately, for an additional Q&A. But David, I'd like to sort of let you have the last word. You were going to end with a quote, if you wanted to share that with us now.
I would actually. Thank you so much for pointing that out. I want to thank all the support people at Temple University Press, because one of the many things that they did was contribute to the name of this of my book. It was always a choice. It sort of came from obviously the manuscript, but I found it interesting that one of the most prominent figures in the book, who spoke about the choices that athletes and other celebrities make, was Paul Robeson, who's obviously a Hall of Fame level football player and just a superior athlete in the early part of the 20th century, who faced, just the most virulent racism that the athletes of that era have ever experienced, and then moved on to become a performer, singer, actor, statesman in so many ways, and of course a leader of the movement to free everybody. He spoke at London's Royal Albert Hall on June 24th, 1937, which was, of course, the dawn of World War II. The Spanish Civil War was in full throttle back then, and he appeared actually distant from London and from that venue to sort of protect his own life and everything. But he spoke about the role that athletes and others with a stage have. Quote, "The artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or for slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative." That was my introduction to this book, and I felt it captured the spirit and the thrust of what I want to talk about when I talked about the history, the present, and the future of activism in the world of sports.
And on that note, I'll let you wish your guests a fond farewell and good night.
I'm so grateful for all of you. Toni Smith-Thompson, Kevin Blackistone, Shalise, Manza Young, and David Alldridge, you've done me a tremendous favor by joining me tonight and bringing your wisdom and your brilliance to this audience tonight. And I appreciate all your support in my career and in my life and for this book. So thank you again for joining me. And we're going to continue this discussion, maybe formally, but certainly informally as we go forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you all. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to our audience who really stuck around for the whole event. We still have at least 20 people still listening in. It was engaging and it was very informative. And I thank you, David, for writing the book and for letting us do this with you this evening. So on that, just want to wish everyone a good night and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.